Shalom, hello, and welcome to our online Haaretz mini-fest within the online edition of this year's Jerusalem Film Festival. In a series of interviews, we, meaning Haaretz journalists, will be talking to the directors and producers of some of the most intriguing films in this festival. Today I have the pleasure of hosting in this fine screen Alex Wynter, who is, amongst many things, also the director of this rather excellent film we just saw, Zaapa. Hello, Alex, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
As fine as I can be in this day and age.
Yes, exactly. Same here.
So we were just watching this film, and the first thing that comes to mind after watching it is that there isn't a single frame in which Frank Zappa is without a cigarette in his hand. Is it something that you noticed during the editing that you did?
No, I mean, he doesn't literally always have a cigarette, but Frank smoked constantly, as a lot of people did in that day and age. And surprisingly, as a lot of people still do in that community.
Yeah, and it's not the only thing that's, I don't know, not so in sync with in 2020. Zappa is in many ways a man from a different era. How do you think he and his music and lyrics and his whole body of work would have been accepted today?
I think in many ways, certain aspects of what he did would be more embraced and more easily embraced today. I think that it was a little hard for certain audiences in his era to know how to appreciate him, because he wasn't really, the perception was that he was a rock guitar player in the vein of a Hendrix or other rock artists of that time. He really wasn't. He was really more of a composer who worked in different genres, including the rock genre. And I think in this day and age, things are a little less in need of getting put in boxes. We live in a more flattened culture, so I think it would actually be a little easier for him to be accepted today.
Yeah, also financially wise, I think. He was the first one to be completely independent, and nowadays you see it all along the industry and the structure of the industry, which has changed towards the Frank Zappa model.
Yes, in fact, literally, Frank and Gail created what is generally considered the boilerplate artist contract. So they were pioneers in artists becoming independents and fighting for their rights. And Frank was very aware of the oncoming digital revolution and how that was going to impact artists for good and for ill. So they were very ahead of their time.
Yeah. When did your initial interest in Frank Zappa begin? What drew you into the Zappaverse, as one might say?
Well, I grew up in the 70s in the United States primarily, England a bit, and the US primarily. So Zappa was a very, very famous artist growing up. And I was very taken by him as a musician, but also as a cultural figure who was extremely involved in political activism and very funny, very biting and witty. So in addition to his musical brilliance, he was also a big part of our culture growing up. He was at the forefront of voting registration rights. He was at the forefront of anti-censorship battles that we were fighting in the US. And that was very inspiring as I grew up. But I really got into his artistry on a much deeper level as an adult.
On what year did you start working on this film? It must have been quite a while before.
I think it was a century or two ago now.
Really?
Yeah. No. It's been a long road. We first decided to try to make a Zappa film about 6 years ago, and I approached Gail Zappa at the very beginning of 2015 to discuss making a film about her husband, and thus began a very long process. We first had to preserve media that was in the vault. That took us 2 years unto itself. We had to raise money to do the vault preservation work. Then we got started on the film, but it's been a long road.
How comes no one tried before to do the definitive Zappa biopic? Or the definitive Zappa documentary biography?
Yeah, there have been documentaries about Zappa before. Some of them are fantastic, actually. It's a very big story, and he was an artist who spanned a long period of time in American and global history, made lots of different kinds of music, and had a huge life. So I actually quite enjoy the documentaries that have come before us. What I was specifically interested in doing artistically was getting inside Zappa and telling a more intimate story about his life as an artist at that time in our history. And I think Gail had never really, as the caretaker of the Zappa estate, I think she'd never really heard a pitch that was coming at it in that way. I didn't realize that when I pitched her. I didn't know what she wanted or if she would take our pitch or not. But I think she was used to getting much more conventional music doc pitches, Zappa as this kind of comical, satirical rock god, and that wasn't what we were interested in doing.
Mm-hmm. I think that's what's so cool about this film. Although he's dead for almost 30 years, he's narrating his story in his own voice. How did you do that?
Well, we were granted access to the vault, and so what the vault provided was a lot of media on Zappa that was first person, either films that he made himself, audio recordings, and then just video of him hanging out with his friends shooting the breeze over many, many, many years, across decades. And then we went my researchers, and we found every other piece of Zappa talking that we could find all over the world. And my editor, Mike Nichols, and I then cobbled together essentially a narrative across time of Zappa talking. And sometimes within one sentence in our film, that sentence is constructed from 3 different decades to make a complete sentence. So it was painstaking, but it was worth it because it gave us a sense of Zappa's presence and his own interior perspective.
Were you aware of the huge amount he had in his vaults, the huge self-documentation that he did all these years?
No, I was absolutely not aware.
So how surprised were you?
Yeah, I was very surprised. I was elated and a little overwhelmed, to be honest, when I saw the space. I was aware there was a vault. There's been knowledge of Zappa's vault for years, but there was no way of knowing that Zappa was creating a kind of living art project of his own with his own work that was private. And that's really what this vault was. It was comprised of painting, photography, film, music, obviously, different musings. And then he would take that stuff and rework it. So he would take 8mm and then dump it onto video 10 years later, recut that, dump it onto a different form of video 10 years after that, rework it again. So it was really a vast living project, essentially, of art that he was involved in. And that's a beautiful thing to witness. I was very, very glad to find it. But some of it was deteriorating, and we had to work on that. And then from an editorial standpoint, it was just a lot of work to get through it all to figure out what we wanted to use for the film.
Yeah, I can imagine that. I read an interview you did with Brett Morgan, who directed Montage of Hack, the documentary about Kurt Cobain. And I did see a few similarities between the approaches of the film. Did you take anything else from that, I think, sort of that much of a unique creation, that much of a unique film?
Well, I really was drawing from a lot of influences. Some were music-oriented, films like Don't Look Back, Cocksucker Blues, the Rolling Stones documentary by Robert Frank, which is a really inspirational film for me. What I liked about Brett's film specifically was how well they conveyed the identity of someone who had been very opaque to most people. I mean, I had met Kurt Cobain, and I found him very inaccessible, even though I met him in personal circumstances. So we really were drawing from a lot of different sources, and really making an attempt to tell a story that would give as much personality and uniqueness to Frank's identity as we possibly could, but in a cinematic way. That was very important to us.
Mm-hmm. Something else that still resonates in my mind after reading your interview with Brett Morgan is that he said it's a personal film for you as much as it is a biopic about Zappa. Did you discover something new about yourself? Did you discover something new about Zappa?
You make a lot of discoveries when you're making films, narrative or documentaries. My documentaries have all been very personal for me in one way or another, sometimes not outwardly, obviously personal, but there's usually some deep connection I feel with the subject. Even if I don't like the subject or wholly agree with the subject, there's still usually something in there that's drawing me to spend that much time working on one thing, because it takes a very long time to do these, and you get very personally invested in them. I grew up in a period that was really connected to Zappa's period. So it brought me back to my own youth, my own political activism, my own artistic interests, certain decisions I'd made in my own life about the kind of values and artistic life I wanted to lead and what the consequences of living that kind of life are, because they can be quite severe. I learned a lot about Zappa, a lot. There's so much depth to him that is conveyed through the vault material, not the least of which he was a much more devoted political activist than I even realized in his private life. He didn't really sound the trumpets about all this activity. There was a humility and a seriousness to the way he went about that activism. And being a very political person myself, I found that very inspiring.
That's very nice to hear. Your previous documentary features were in a totally different aesthetic approach. Over here, you mostly had to rely on the archives. How did it change your work process?
In some ways, quite a bit, and in other ways, not so much. I come from a narrative background, so I approach every story as a sort of a classical three-act structure that will have a certain kind of resonance for an audience. I don't tend to work in hyper unconventional storytelling forms. I enjoy them. It's not really what I tend to do. So I wrote a lot on this film. I wrote a lot of narrative structure and kind of built a foundation that gave me comfort to give us more freedom in the edit to play and to play with form based on the vault material. So in some ways it was a similar process. What was different is I normally will get a lot of interviews and then those will inform a lot of our structure. And in this case, Mike Nichols, the editor, and I, we didn't want to do that. I wanted to work the other way, which is we built as much of the story from vault material as we could, and then went and got only a small handful of interviews to fill very, very specific holes in our narrative. I really would go into some of these interviews with only 2 or 3 questions. Even if I talked longer or they talked longer, I knew I had to come away with answers to those questions. So there were processes that were different. And obviously the vault made the film process take longer because we really just needed time to watch stuff and to absorb who Frank was through that media.
Mm-hmm. To me, your previous documentary films were of someone who is trying to make sense of the world we live in right now. How is Frank Zappa connected to that thread?
Very significantly. Zappa was very prescient. I think a lot of people who were artistically and politically astute that in the ways that Frank was, meaning awake and really connected to the world around you and to what came before you. Frank drew a lot from the art that preceded him, whether it was popular music or classical music or art. But he was very engaged with the sort of the founding aspects of the American Constitution, civil rights, the Bill of Rights. And so in a political way, he was also very well educated, self-educated, but well educated, and very connected to the times, extremely concerned about the rise of authoritarianism, both in America and in the rest of the world, very aware that the digital revolution would create sort of a democratization for people and for artists, but also cause us to lose more of our privacy and help in some ways provide more tools to authoritarians and propaganda. So I think that, you know, in our current climate in America and perhaps in other places, I think Zappa would have a lot to say about this current moment where there are so many issues around civil rights and the rise of authoritarianism and governments acting, improperly towards their citizens and their neighbors, and also the need for an active citizenry that's voting and being involved. I think that's something he was very outspoken about, and I think he would have been disheartened but not surprised to see where we've landed.
Yeah, I'm sure he had to say. I'm sure he would have had something to say about what happens in Israel as well. One of the more extraordinary moments in your film is your meeting with Bruce Bickford. It seems to me like he deserves a documentary of his own. This guy is just amazing. Did you know about him? Did you know of the huge amount of work that he did?
Yes, I was intimately familiar with Bruce. I came up as a great student of animation, claymation, and other forms. Bickford, Jan Svankmajer, Norman McLaren, a lot of those people were big influences on me when I was a film student. Zapa himself, to coin your own phrase, made a documentary about Bruce called The Amazing Mr. Bickford. So I recommend you check that out.
I will.
But the Vault, yeah, it's great. The Vault unleashed an enormous amount of unseen Bickford material, an enormous amount. I was so grateful to find it. I became very friendly with Bruce over the years while we were making the film. Sadly, he passed recently.
Oh.
So I was able to get up to Seattle to his studio and spend time with him, and I spent time with him in LA, and he was really gratified to learn that so much of the work he did that had been sealed away by Frank existed. And so we preserved almost all of that work, to be honest with you, and we'll eventually figure out a way to get that out.
Oh, that is very cool. I must ask, what is your favorite Zapa phase?
Gosh, I really love all of it. I love Hot Rats early on, and I love The Yellow Shark at the end of his career, which is the more classical, symphonic, orchestral music. And I really like everything in between. I love the 70s heyday. Apostrophe and Overnight Sensation are great albums. But I like Frank at his most extreme, I think. So I think the very early stuff for me and the really radical later stuff is probably my favorite.
Very cool. I sympathize with that. One confession which involves one last question. I rewatched Bill and Ted Face the Music during election night because I had to chill out just a little bit. But it got, I was so scared because I thought, okay, this is what's going to happen to the world, and the election is just a complete allegory to what we're seeing right now. So I have to ask, are Bill and Ted Zapa fans? And not just because he recorded with Steve Vai?
I think that Bill and Ted would have greatly admired Zapa, especially his guitar playing. Though I would imagine that our daughters would have really turned us on to the deeper aspects of Zappa's genius. Mm-hmm. So I think that given the family layout of Bill and Ted, the way we ended up evolving and our kids evolved, I think my son is 22 and he's a painter. He's in art school, and he reminds me a lot of the daughters as they're written in this film. He comes from that generation, and they don't care about boundaries. They don't care about genre. They just take in everything if they're intrigued by it. And I think that Bill and Ted would have learned a lot from their kids about a genius like Frank.
Well, I have to agree. Thank you very much, Alex. This has been a pleasure, and the film is extraordinary, so kudos for that. And also, Bill and Ted Face the Music is an amazing film, and I recommend everyone should watch it. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. I'm a great admirer of Haaretz and read it often, so it's good to be here.
Nice.